you'll see how impressive it is. And I thought, if I could ever become half the scholar that this scholar is, I will feel good about this journey towards the doctoral degree. So I just want to say all that to say you're about to be gifted by an immense scholar. And thank you, Dr. Maparyan, for being with us. We really appreciate you and look forward to your presentation. Thank you. Also, after Dr. Maparyan's presentation, a conversation will be facilitated by Drs. Alika, Galloway and Dr. Carolyn Pressler from the United Theological Seminary, Lisbon City. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it time for me to start? I can't hear clearly.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Yetunde for inviting me to be a part of this event. I was very, very excited to be invited after we started our conversation on the topic of womanism and ended up on the topic of the Baha'i faith, because in the book that she mentioned, The Womanist Idea, I didn't interweave as much about the Baha'i faith in that text as I did to some of the other religious traditions that I had studied. But the Baha'i faith, it takes me back to my origins and is really the foundation of my thinking about social problem solving. So I'm excited to be able to share some today about the Baha'i perspective on social problem solving in a very particular area, and that relates to race and racism. I want to begin with something that gives you a little bit of insight into me and my own past. And that is, let's see if I can advance my slides here. This is a picture of an article from Ebony magazine in April of 1965. They did a feature story on the Baha'i faith, and as you can see here, the world's newest religion stresses brotherhood and peace. But my personal connection is to the two individuals seated in the very center of the picture, a white man on the left and a black woman in the middle, who happened to be my parents. They became Baha'is in college in the early 1960s during the fervor of the civil rights movement, and they met each other at a Baha'i youth conference. And from that point forward, the Baha'i faith and solving the racial issues of society were a big part of both of their lives. And it's interesting that the last question in the previous session made reference to one of the most famous interracial marriages in the Baha'i faith between Louis and Louisa Gregory, which in some respects established a tone within the Baha'i faith that our faith is seeking to promote a level of intimacy between people of different races that completely overrides the kind of animosities and tensions that are in the world today. But interracial marriage is not the only solution that the Baha'i faith puts forth in terms of how to work on these issues. And in my presentation today, I really want to focus primarily on a few key passages from the Baha'i writings that set a very different tenor for the solution of racial issues in society. And I want to share my close reading with you as sort of a setting the stage for the conversation that we'll have afterwards between myself, Dr. Pressler, and Dr. Galloway. All right, so I want to start just by talking about, from my own perspective, what some of the gifts of Baha'u'llah to the world are. Since the occasion for our session today is the bicentenary of Baha'u'llah's birth, and Baha'u'llah is the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, I just want to get very personal and talk about what has really animated my spirit from the Baha'i faith. The first thing is that Baha'u'llah offers a world system based on affirmation of human nobility and the cultivation of spiritual civilization. The idea that every single human being on planet Earth, everyone who's ever lived and everyone who ever will live, has at their core a seed of nobility based on their connection to the divine, animates everything that the Baha'i faith understands about human beings and their possibility. And in turn, our understandings of what society can become take into account this spiritually based nobility of human beings. And on that foundation, we can do all kinds of problem solving that we might not imagine in the current context, where we tend not to take human nobility and the spiritual nature of human beings into account. Second, and really an extension of this, Baha'u'llah offers sacred tools for social transformation and human elevation. So the idea that we are oriented towards the development of excellences or virtues based on our inherent nobility and offering those to society for the improvement of society is really what the social teachings of the Baha'i faith are about. Also related to this, Baha'u'llah offers a vision of humanity's maturation in the direction of unity, justice, peace, and an ever-advancing civilization, which includes not only these moral developments, but also even technological developments. We imagine a society in which the education of all human beings and the self-actualization of everyone in line with their spiritual virtues creates an amazing, wondrous, beautiful, enjoyable society and civilization. And the last thing that I think is really a gift from Baha'u'llah is really unique to the Baha'i faith, but there's a sacred covenant for protecting the unity of the Baha'i faith that Baha'u'llah established in his will and testament, passing the leadership and the guidance system of the Baha'i faith onto his son, who in turn passed it on to his grandson, and again onto now an elected international body called the the Universal House of Justice. So this means that while we, the Baha'is all over the world are imagining and attempting to live in this concept of a global society, we also have things that keep us unified and organized together, which the reason for that will become more plain with some of the quotes I'm going to share. And I'm happy also to show this stamp from the Netherlands that was the Netherlands' contribution to celebrating the bicentenary of Baha'u'llah. All right, so I want to now share something directly from one of Baha'u'llah's sacred tablets. It's called the Tablet to Maqsud. It's one of my favorite passages in the Baha'i writings, and it's one that I refer to often. So I'm going to read directly, because since you don't have the text in front of you, and since many people aren't that familiar with the Baha'i text, I want to actually share some text directly. This one says, "The great being saith, O ye children of men, the fundamental purpose animating the faith of God and his religion is to safeguard the interests and promote the unity of the human race, and to foster the spirit of love and fellowship amongst men. Suffer it not to become a source of dissension and discord, of hate and enmity. This is the straight path, the fixed and immovable foundation. Whatsoever is raised on this foundation, the changes and chances of the world can never impair its strength, nor will the revolution of countless centuries undermine its structure." And I just want to make a point here that when Baha'u'llah is talking about the faith of God and his religion, he's not just talking about the Baha'i faith, but there's an understanding in the Baha'i faith that all faiths come from the same God. So the idea is, why was religion put into the world at all? Why did God communicate with humanity at all? The idea is that it's to safeguard the interests and promote the unity of the human race and to help us to develop. So I'm going to read another section from this same passage. He says, "Our hope is that the world's religious leaders and the rulers thereof will unitedly arise for the reformation of this age and the rehabilitation of its fortunes. Let them, after meditating on its needs, take counsel together, and through anxious and full deliberation, minister to a diseased and sorely afflicted world the remedy it requireth." So here again, we see Baha'u'llah talking about a kind of process and a kind of spirit for social problem solving in which diverse leaders who have leadership over diverse populations come together with the well-being of humankind firmly fixed in mind, and then actually meditating on its needs, counseling together, coming up with solutions together, deliberating together, and then administering a remedy to humanity. So there is an orientation already at the core towards the well-being and flourishing of all the people on earth. So as I mentioned, the Covenant of Baha'u'llah passed guidance from himself, Baha'u'llah, to his son Abdu'l-Baha, who was mentioned in the previous session, and then later to Shoghi Effendi, each upon the passing of these. And then after Shoghi Effendi, we were directed towards electing a global administrative body called the Universal House of Justice. But the point I want to make about all of these figures is that there has been an unbroken thread of concern for the welfare of humanity, and within that, for ending racism. Because Baha'u'llah in his own time in the 1800s, even though he was from Iran, his understandings of the world were that racism was a huge problem that needed to end. And Abdu'l-Baha, who had the opportunity to travel all around the world and visit many places and see it with his own eyes, further took up the cause of ending racism. And Shoghi Effendi really developed a great expanse of writings and guidance on not only understanding the problem of racism, but how to do the social transformations to eradicate it. So I really want to hone in on that, and I want to pull a passage from one of Shoghi Effendi's books. The title of that book is The Advent of Divine Justice. It was published in 1938, and it was a series of letters that Shoghi Effendi had written to the Baha'is in the United States and Canada. So it's addressed to the beloved of God and the handmaids of the merciful throughout the United States and Canada. I just want to pull out a single very potent passage that the Baha'i community has continued to reflect on and draw guidance from since it was first published in 1938. That passage is called The Most Challenging Issue, and here's a part of it. It says, as to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. So the idea here is that there are many, many problems that Baha'is face in trying to transform the world in the direction that we just established in the quote I read from Baha'u'llah. But he viewed the issue of racial prejudice as being the most vital and the most challenging out of all of these issues at this stage of the Baha'i evolution. So it might seem like 1938 was a long time ago, but to Baha'is, we're still very much drawing guidance. And if we look at the kinds of racial issues that were going on in the 1930s or even earlier in the 19th century when Baha'u'llah was writing, we can see that there is also continuity in many of those issues. And while advances have been made, we're still very much wrestling with thorny racial problems. So more from this passage, Shoghi Effendi wrote, the ceaseless exertions which this issue of paramount importance calls for, the sacrifices it must impose, the care and vigilance it demands, the moral courage and fortitude it requires, the tact and sympathy it necessitates, invest this problem, which the American believers are still far from having satisfactorily resolved, with an urgency and importance that cannot be overestimated. I highlighted these particular words from the passage that relate to the kinds of action that Shoghi Effendi was exhorting the American and Canadian believers to undertake. And they are not only actions, but they are also emotional postures. And I want to pull them out as highlights because I want to point out that these attributes are not the typical postures associated with efforts to eradicate racism in the world today. Rather than positioning us for a kind of struggle, opposition, warfare, and self-preservation, the Baha'i racial transformation posture calls us to a kind of deep humility, self-restraint, indefatigability, and frankly, optimism to achieve our desired end of eradicating racism and substituting it with a new set of relations and emotions based on friendship, respect, virtue, amity, as well as a deep egalitarianism, a love-based form of regard and respect, and reciprocity or collectively justice. This is what I would put in front of you in terms of a Baha'i paradigm for racial transformation. However, I want to pull more from what Shoghi Effendi wrote in this passage. He said, all who stand identified with it, and in this case he was referring to the Baha'i faith, must participate in and lend their assistance, each according to his or her capacity, experience, and opportunities, to the common task of fulfilling the instructions, realizing the hopes, and following the example of Abdu'l-Baha. Now, why is he referring back to Abdu'l-Baha? In the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Baha is held up as the exemplar of the virtues inculcated within Baha'u'llah's revelation, and he is a common point of reference for all Baha'is. A few stories from Abdu'l-Baha's life, specifically from his journey to the United States in 1912, will give a flavor of this. And I, again, very much appreciate that at least one of those stories was brought up in the previous meeting. When he came to the United States in 1912, Abdu'l-Baha immediately noted the state of race relations, and he immediately began confronting it in public and in private. For example, he spoke at Howard University He gave 2 talks at the Chicago NAACP convention. And as you can see from this illustration, he was featured as a Man of the Month in Du Bois's Crisis magazine as a result. He integrated the Baha'i Temple Unity, which was a group of eminent Baha'is who had come together to oversee the building of the first Baha'i temple in the West. And in fact, the very Louis Gregory, who was mentioned previously, was put on that committee to integrate it by Abdu'l-Baha. And he also, in a more private sphere, did things, for example, disrupted seating arrangements at luncheons hosted by rich and powerful white Baha'is in order to seat African Americans next to him at important functions, and on and on. And he gave many public lectures on race amity, which are captured in the text, The Promulgation of Universal Peace, which is a collection of his speeches from this tour. Now, if I had more time, I would go deeper into the text, The Promulgation of Universal Peace, and some of Abdu'l-Baha's speeches, but I urge you that if you are curious about more about the Baha'i perspective on racial amity, that you add this text to your collection. So there are many transformational principles within the Baha'i faith that have informed what we have taken from Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi in terms of ending racism and bringing to fruition the oneness of humanity, justice, and sustainable peace. But I want to just point out, amongst the many principles, these 3 I think are very important. One I've already mentioned, which is the principle of the inherent nobility of all people. If we look around the world today, we see that we are not acting as though we think everyone is of noble origins, and we're not raising our children or presenting our media or devising policies as though we really understand that all people are noble. Although we have a concept of equality that we sometimes make reference to, that equality doesn't necessarily include with it the concept of nobility, which I think is a very important foundation in Baha'i thought. Another principle is this notion that the earth is one country and mankind its citizens. The idea is that essentially, from a spiritual perspective, this is a borderless planet, and that all people are of a single kind. And even though there's a great deal of cultural diversity that is highly valued within the Baha'i faith, the notion is that we are all equal, and that regardless of what nation we come from and what political arbitrary boundaries have been set up to define nations, essentially we are of a common kind, and that our goal is to raise up a world civilization that recognizes the oneness of humanity. The third principle that I think is really important for addressing racism as well as so many other things is the Baha'i principle of the independent investigation of truth. That helps explain part of why we have elected bodies instead of single pastoral figureheads as the guidance structure within the Baha'i faith. The idea is that in this modern age of humanity, and as we move towards our human maturation, that we're all invested with the ability to investigate truth for ourselves. And hence, while the Baha'i faith has principles, the understandings about how to live them out and make the world a better place, move towards this ever-advancing civilization, rely very much on the inspired genius of human beings who are operating within the framework of moving towards human well-being. I just want to share a few more of Baha'u'llah's words on human nobility. This is one of his famous scriptures on this subject. O son of spirit, noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created. So in this, we see a kind of methodology for elevating ourselves beyond our current, prevalence of conflict, inequality, violence, all those sorts of things. He's saying, rise into who you are, and who you are is noble. I want to say a few more things about the example of Baha'u'llah. If we were to go deeper into the passage from Shoghi Effendi that I was quoting from earlier, he actually outlines these particular characteristics of Abdu'l-Baha that he said were pivotal to improving race relations. First was his courage in terms of speaking up when he was observing racial prejudice or racial injustice going on. Secondly, his genuine love for all people, regardless of their background. This extended not only to race, but to people of all social classes. No matter what kind of condition people were in, he genuinely showed love. Also, his informal and indiscriminating fellowship, the sense that he wasn't afraid to bring all different kinds of people into the same room and into the same circle of conversation. He didn't follow the lines of separation and segregation that had been established by custom in the societies where he lived and worked. He also had contempt for and impatience of criticism, that being criticism of his strategy to unite humanity. So if people said, well, we don't like how you're doing things to unite the races, he basically said, this is what I'm going to do. But he also exercised tact and wisdom. He had a keen sense of justice. He had spontaneous sympathy for the people who were downtrodden, an ever-abiding sense of oneness of the human race, and overflowing love for all of its members. There are stories after stories after stories, and so many books you can get detailing stories from Abdu'l-Baha's life that give life to all of these characteristics, but in the interest of time, I will move on and return to our passage from Shoghi Effendi. Now, this is the injunctions that he gave to the members of the Baha'i community as he was charging them with solving the racial problems in North America and indeed in the world. He said, every organized community enlisted under the banner of Baha'u'llah should feel it to be its first and inescapable obligation to nurture, encourage, and safeguard every minority belonging to any faith, race, class, or nation within it. So saying there that our obligation was to protect not only Baha'is, but people of any background who were subject to inequality and injustice in the world, and lift them up and to move everyone in the direction of a social system that understands the nobility, value, and equality of all people. Additionally, he exhorted us this way. He said, freedom from racial prejudice in any of its forms should, at such a time as this, when an increasingly large section of the human race is falling a victim to its devastating ferocity, be adopted as the watchword of the entire body of the American believers, in whichever state they reside, in whatever circles they move, whatever their age, traditions, tastes, or habits. Now here he was really alluding to the fact that the United States, at least at that time, was still very much racially segregated. So whatever state they resided, whether it was a state in the former Confederacy or a state in the North or in the West, anywhere, and whatever circles they moved in, regardless of social class, whether they were racially homogeneous because they had failed to integrate themselves, whatever their age, traditions, tastes, and habits, he was saying it doesn't matter who you are, you have to, develop freedom from racial prejudice internally within yourself, but also in our community so that we could stand as a beacon to others. And then again, he said, it should be consistently demonstrated in every phase of their activity in life, whether in the Baha'i community or outside it, in public or in private, formally as well as informally, individually as well as in their official capacity as organized groups, committees, and assemblies. So in other words, there's no escape. There's no angle that you can turn to get away from this responsibility to eradicate racism and racial prejudice, meaning doing the inner work of routing out whatever racism society has trained you to have, and also changing society externally, the laws, the policies, the customs, the norms, what's in the media, etc. And finally, from this passage, Shoghi Effendi said, it should be deliberately cultivated through the various and everyday opportunities, no matter how insignificant, that present themselves, whether in their homes, their business offices, their schools and colleges, their social parties and recreation grounds, their Baha'i meetings, conferences, conventions, summer schools, and assemblies. So basically, I think with this passage, he was saying there's no area too small in life, there's no interaction too minor or unimportant to think about the impact of it on our efforts to eradicate racism and to remind ourselves of our obligation to always be about that purpose. And I feel like in this passage, he's even anticipating what today we call microaggressions. We think, oh, these are tiny things, but social scientists have let us know that the impact of those tiny things is in fact big. And so Shoghi Effendi is exhorting us to look at even the tiniest things. So I want to end with the words of Baha'u'llah. I'm returning back to the passage that I started with at the beginning. And he says in it, that one indeed is a man who today dedicateth himself to the service of the entire human race. The great being saith, blessed and happy is he that ariseth to promote the best interests of the peoples and kindreds of the earth. It is not for him to pride himself who loveth his own country, but rather for him who loveth the whole world. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. So I'm going to end there because I think these words are pretty self-explanatory, and I've set the tone for the Baha'i perspective on how to deal with race and racism. And now we can turn to a discussion.
John, do you need to do a check or anything, or we're good?
Yeah, Shauna, if you hear some feedback, I'll see if I can do that.
And we can get Dr. Maparyan's full image on the screen.
But I got her,
Where's her calendar?
John, I'm not sure this is on, is it? Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Hi.
Does that work?
yes. And,
Beautiful.
Dr. Galloway, can I get you to sit right in between that white microphone so that she can hear you?
Okay.
Can she hear that?
Yes, the white microphone she'll pick up on, and we'll do a quick test. She can't see you, unfortunately. We can't see. She can't see anyone. I'm going to see if I can. She can see them, which is the important part. I'm going to see if I can get a camera to turn, but again, I'm duct taping everything. All right, we'll let you guys see.
Do you want to go? Shall I?
Yeah, the group left and this.
If you would all stop being so obvious.
Dr. Maparyan, did I pronounce your name right, by the way?
It's Maparyan. The R is silent, but thank you.
Okay,
It's like, it rhymes with papaya.
thank you. You present a wonderful and rich framework for Baha'is to work in resisting racism, and I'm very moved by it. My first question, though, is one I run into with my own faith framework also, which is, how do we resist racism when those who are embracing it don't share our belief system, don't believe in the nobility of all humanity? How do we cross that bridge?
That's a really great question, and one that I think about a lot. And the way I answer it actually hails back to some extent to my training in psychology, and it requires us to recollect that as human beings, we are more than just our belief systems. We are emotional beings, we are physical beings, we are intellectual or cognitive beings, and we are also social and spiritual beings. And our belief system really only falls within the strand of our intellectual selves. But there are ways to engage people emotionally and environmentally and socially that can still have a transformative impact. And I actually would like to highlight that I prefer the word transformation to resistance, because I think that resistance implies that we're setting up an opposition, whereas transformation implies that we are changing energy from one form to another. So for example, I think about my own time growing up in the United States South. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida for the most part, and it was a pretty racist environment for some of the times that I was growing up. And many of the neighbors, particularly in the first community that my family moved to when we went there, were very explicit in their racist attitudes and often said things to me and my family members that were very hurtful from a racist perspective. But I can also remember making friends with people by engaging them around things other than their racial beliefs. And over time, these would sometimes be transformative. So for example, there are many topics that people can talk about besides their beliefs. They can talk about things that they have in common, like how their families are doing, or things that they care about, like a common sports team, or things about food. There are ways for people to come together across difference at the same time as they are holding significant forms of difference. And sometimes the transformation takes place in an emotional or an environmental sphere before it takes place in a cognitive sphere. So we really have to work all of the angles at once, which is part of why I said optimism is so necessary. Because if you believe that when a person is interacting with you from their racist beliefs, if you believe that that is all there is to them and all that is possible for them, you won't get very far. But if you're able to see past that and understand that something caused them to have that belief system and something could uncause it, then you start thinking about all of the angles from which you could create a transformation, and you work those angles.
May I follow up with that?
Of course.
I can see how that works on a one-to-one personal level. Are there ways it might work at a situation such as Charlottesville? That is on a communal and/or political level.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that both levels have to be addressed simultaneously, because all sustainable social change has to have inner, outer, micro, and macro dimensions being addressed at once. When I think about large racist incidences or conditions that take place in society, again, I return to that question of how was that situation caused and how can it be uncaused? For example, one of the things I understand about the United States culture is that while we place a very important value on the freedom of speech, we don't have a good system for responding to forms of speech that form human consciousness in a negative direction. And so we tend to have a free-for-all kind of understanding that makes it possible that for us to just say, well, it's freedom of speech, there's nothing I can do about that, rather than understanding that one free speech act can be met by another free speech act, and that in the course of long haul processes, for example, the socialization of children through curricula in school, the degree to which school curricula do or do not talk about the truth of the racial reality, do not provide exposure to values about human nobility and about the value of diverse groups. All of these things are collectively causing or not causing the racial situation that we want to be in. And so when those things erupt, they are the epiphenomenon of causes that went far before. And so we have to have a long-term approach where we're understanding that if we want to cause a different reality, we have to mobilize collective will to make the conditions different. So another arena where it has an influence on society as a whole is the media, whether it's the mass media like televised media, print media, radio, that sort of thing, or whether it's now social media, the internet, and so on. The kinds of things that prevail there influence the norms in public sentiment, whether it's at the level of emotion or cognition. I think, for example, in a small personal example, but big, when I was growing up, fashion magazines never showed women who look like me. And so things that I might have learned about how to feel about myself positively, or things I might have learned about things as simple as how to do my hair, didn't exist. But over time, somebody made it their purpose to diversify the types of women who appear in fashion magazines to now, where we have a very multicultural sense of beauty being many different kinds of people. That was a long effort that took place over a generation or more to create a change in how society thinks. And someone had to realize at day one that I've got to plant the seed right now and water it for 25 years before we're going to see the center move. It's that kind of thinking. There's nothing that we can do on a short-term basis. These things are all long, planful activities where people have an end point in mind that they're systematically working towards and mobilizing the will and using their resources and power to make those things come into being.
Thank you. Wow.
I think I'm doing something to the microphone. But greetings to you. Thank you so much for this time. My question, well, I probably have 1,000 of them for you. But part of my question, after looking at your presentation today, was how is the Baha'i movement interacting with the Black Lives Movement in terms of not only mitigating the harmful effects of racism, but also advocating on a public policy level, racist policies and agendas.
Right, thank you. Again, that's also a very good question, because the Baha'i faith has a long history of working on racial issues, particularly in the United States. And many of the collaborations have been informal, but sometimes there have been times when the Baha'i community have reached out to policymakers, such as Congress people or others who are in a policy-making capacity. Right now, I would say that a lot of the things, collaborations such as they are, would take place in the space of social media, where people, for example, on Facebook, there are entire groups that are dedicated to exploring the kinds of issues that Black Lives Matter are exploring and figuring out how to bring the Baha'i principles to bear on the issues that are being talked about in society. One of the biggest things that has been, I will say, an effort of great work, or maybe some would even call it a challenge, has been that the Baha'i faith historically has very much come from a racial amity perspective that focuses on the cultivation of friendship and maybe has a more emotional tenor in the sense of working on changing racial prejudice at the level of how people feel about each other, so that they will not in turn enact policies that reflect racist beliefs, or that they will dismantle those that exist. Whereas many of the Black social movement manifestations, from the civil rights movement to Black Power to now Black Lives Matter, have focused more on a kind of a adversarial understanding. I would argue that this understanding, not just for the Black social movement, but for many social movements, has come out of this sort of Marxist idea that there are, opposing classes that are always in conflict. But the Baha'i understanding about the world is not that way. We don't see opposing classes that are always in conflict. We see people who are one human family who have things that they need to work out and must understand their commonality and never veer from that understanding. So to bring those two discourses into conciliation is really the task that's at the heart of your question. And I think there are a lot of fora and other kinds of configurations in which that's taking place. And in fact, the Baha'i Office of Public Affairs in Washington, D.C. Does a lot of work and is actually in the process right now of planning a big race conference that will take place in 2018. So stay tuned. There's a lot of interaction, but that's been sort of the tenor of those interactions.
That's very exciting.
Maybe if you spoke more into this one.
Hello? Okay. So as we look at, I was intrigued going back on your website last couple of days about the whole Baha'i community. My personal interaction was in early 1970s in college, where I met a young African-American woman who was very much interested and very much engaged in the Baha'i community. Now, most of us actually see her often on the media. If any of you have ever seen the Humana commercial, and there's this beautiful African-American woman that has a short white afro, and her name is Cheryl Riley, and she's an international furniture designer. So she introduced me, a African-American evangelical Californian in the hippie movement, to the Baha'i community. And I felt like I had come home. I felt like it was a community at that time, and as I've since studied what it represents, where the beloved community was being actualized on earth, that it was no longer the impossible dream. Now, because of some of my issues and my understandings at that time, I could not join it, even though she really tried to get me to. But I knew my parents would kill me. So the devout Presbyterians, oh no, they would have had trouble.
You love Jesus, come on.
They would have had a lot of trouble. I know my parents, and they would have had a lot of trouble. However, the manifestation for me of the impossible dream really now resonates with what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying, that he believes that the next manifestation of the Buddha will come in community rather as an individual, which is very fascinating. And it seems like in some ways from your presentation and what I've read, that there's some corollaries. Can you tell me if I'm wrong?
No, you're right. There actually are some corollaries, because the Baha'i faith very much understands that the big developmental humanity for the big developmental hurdle for humanity right now is coming into a commonly held understanding of its own oneness. And Thich Nhat Hanh in his own work talks a lot about interbeing, the notion that we inter-are, that we are interconnected. And the Baha'i faith takes that even to the next level and says not only we're interconnected, we are essentially one being made of many parts, which is all of the individual human beings. And so Baha'i faith strategically, in terms of our own internal processes for realizing our beliefs, very much orients on how to make groups and communities work effectively, how to make groups and communities consultative, peaceful, just, genuinely loving and friendly, and how to extend that not just within Baha'i enclaves, but into the communities where we live and work. So that the idea is that regardless of the belief system to which you ascribe, you can be part of a process that's going to transform and override humanity's current tendencies toward conflict and inequality and injustice and violence and those things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you were speaking of the different qualities within Baha'i, it reminded me very much of the philosophy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But then I got worried that I don't want to blur differences, because I think that's one thing that the dominant culture tends to try to do. And I wondered if you could tease out a little bit how you see yourselves, you in the Baha'i faith, as differing from, as well as similar to, the nonviolent love that Dr. King espoused.
Okay, I think that one of the real basic commonalities between the philosophy and actually the strategy of Martin Luther King and that of Baha'is is that both were resting on a notion of being inspired by the divine, or being able to take social problems to God and religion to help solve them, and understanding that religion and spirituality have things to offer the social change process or the social problem solving process. So that is one thing I think was a commonality. And I think that many of the mobilizing tactics that Martin Luther King used were obviously drawn from Mahatma Gandhi, and through his conversations with Bayard Rustin and others, were also drawing from Hinduism and Buddhism indirectly, and in the sense that this idea of nonviolent social change, which sometimes requires people to go against laws, even though they're doing that in a peaceful way. Baha'is generally have a belief in following laws and changing laws through means other than breaking laws. And so that would be a distinction between the methodology that Martin Luther King used in leading the civil rights movement and the methodology that Baha'is would use for making social change. So even though there were some Baha'is who participated in civil disobedience, and I know that because my mother was one of them, I also know that we are encouraged to respect the law as a way of making the law be a guidance system for humankind, and to improve law in line with these values on human well-being. So many laws are not designed with human well-being in mind, but we try to use strategies to change or create laws and create social processes and norms in ways that respect the law as an institution that can organize society effectively.
Thank you. That's what I was interested in. And that would be a distinction between you and, say, William Barber, who's one of the leaders I look to for inspiration and guidance, frankly. I have known you primarily as a leading womanist scholar, with your womanist reader and the womanist idea.
Yes.
And I am curious what resources in particular you find in your Baha'i faith to support womanism, to support the equality of genders, the diversity of genders as far as that goes.
Right, sure. I think that the perspectives that I've drawn from the Baha'i faith about social problem solving, including issues related to sex and gender, and the perspectives that I've presented in womanism are very similar, because the Baha'i ideas are so embedded in me from my upbringing. But I would say a few things. First of all, the Baha'i faith has always put forward the equality of women and men as a principle from Baha'u'llah's own words. And so at the time Baha'u'llah was writing, I don't think there was much of a sense of gender diversity, so he didn't write about gender diversity. But in more recent writings from the Universal House of Justice and others, we understand that the Baha'i community understands that the world society is embracing of everyone, so that people of all genders would be welcome in this ever-advancing civilization that we envision. So my womanist idea is really this notion that all of the world's spiritual traditions contribute something valuable and meaningful to our social justice and social change problem-solving efforts, and that the big contribution of womanism is to say, let spirituality and religion and other kinds of traditions, whether they're wisdom traditions, initiatic traditions, mystical traditions, let them be a part of how we do this social change problem solving.
Thank you.
As we talk about issues regarding the environment and earth, and having the earth as our sister, our mother, our brother, our community, a separate entity and yet interdependent with us, what lessons, as we continue to see the erosion of the earth and the erosion of policies around issues of protecting our mother, protecting our family, what policies, what issues, what opportunities do you see that are uniquely available now?
Okay, so generally speaking, or specifically from the Baha'i perspective, I just want to make sure I understand your question.
Yes, from the Baha'i perspective.
Okay. I think that from the Baha'is perspective, one of the foundational ideas is that creation is divine and that respecting all dimensions of creation is important. The idea that the optimal human life, individually or collectively, requires the earth and all of the other kinds of beings to also be in good relation is part of the Baha'i understanding. And that is in line with many other thinkers who have offered similar ideas about the interconnectedness of human beings, the earth, and the spirit world. And that's also something that I've talked a lot about in my womanist writings. It's impossible to imagine human life being all that it can be without imagining that the environmental substrate from which we draw our physical sustenance, and indeed perhaps some of our spiritual sustenance, not being in good condition, or having exploitative relationships with other non-human aspects of earth. We can't imagine that having a good outcome. So the idea is that all of these things are intertwined, all of them are divinely infused, and that would be our starting point for our understandings, our actions, and our strategies.
I really celebrate as a second generation womanist. I really, honestly, I couldn't figure it out until probably yesterday how many generations I was, because my mentor was Jackie Grant. So then I am the daughter. I'm the daughter. So as a second generation person, I am so elated that this conversation has moved to include the earth, because when we were first starting, even with the works of James Cone, Dolores Williams, all of the other second and maybe first generation scholars around womanists, we were not yet at that point. We were talking about it in conversation, but we weren't writing about it. So I just wanted to tell you, thank you so much. And I'm just encouraged and celebrate the fact that you are able to do that, both out of your Baha'i tradition and as your womanist tradition. Thank you.
And I would add to that I think one of the things that has really helped that thread develop in womanism was people's affiliation with or studying of many African religious traditions, African derived religion, and African traditional religion, as well as other indigenous traditions from other communities that have a very earth honoring and earth focused perspective. And it really gave us some new ways to think about it, because some of the Abrahamic religions don't emphasize earth in the same way as some of the indigenous African and other indigenous spiritual traditions.
I appreciate that because when we first started, as we first started the conversation, we were so,
Go on. No, finish your thought.
okay. As we first started the conversation at ITC and other places, to see the conversation expand is so glorious. Because we were so much in the fight just to have voice.
Right.
But to be able to expand the conversation to include brothers and sisters, but particularly other Afrocentric or African-minded persons is exciting, and yet we wrestle with how to maintain the, how to stop fighting about it, how to have more conversation about it, and yet not get so far away from its original origins that we fought so hard for, that we stay authentic. But the way that the movement is working is one that is so inclusive and so beautiful, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
The note that Dr. Yatunde just gave me corresponds very much to what I think we were thinking anyway, which is we only have a few more minutes. We'd like to see if there are questions from the audience. And if you would raise your hands and we'll call on you, and then Dr. Alika can rephrase them or repeat them so that Dr. Maparyan can hear them. Fair? Okay. What questions would you like to ask Dr. Maparyan? Come on, I have 7 billion, so you have to have some.
I would
Yes.
just like to know who she is and where she is and what she teaches. Just who is this person?
They would like to know who you are.
All right, sure. I'm sorry I didn't properly introduce myself at the beginning. Currently, I am the executive director of the Wellesley Centers for Women, which is a women and gender-focused research and action institute located at Wellesley College, which is a women's college in Wellesley, Massachusetts. I came here prior to being here as a professor of women's studies and African American studies from Georgia State University, where I taught for, I think, 12 years. And before that, I was a professor of Africana Studies and Developmental Psychology at the University of Georgia. And I also have a faculty appointment here at Wellesley. I'm a professor of Africana Studies as well. So basically, I'm a professor, but who's running a research center in this phase of my life.
Wow. Thank you. Dr. Yatunde.
It's clear from the presentation, the interdisciplinary background that you possess. And I'm wondering if you can imagine being a theology professor in the next phase of your life.
What a provocative question. Not that I've gotten so far as to thinking about the next phase of my life yet, although I do sometimes when I'm having a really busy day fantasize about my retirement, in which I can be a mystic in a cave somewhere. So I think that really my spiritual sensibilities and aspirations and curiosities are probably the deepest of my being. And matters that might fall into the realm of theology are things that are always going to be part of my life, no matter whatever else I'm doing. And in fact, when I wrote the womanist idea, it was really emblematic of a moment of a watershed moment in my life when I decided to take the risk to allow my academic and spiritual lives to converge. Because I felt that there was so much that I was learning in my own spiritual life and my own spiritual explorations and studies that informed the things I thought about academically, but I felt barred by the culture of academia from speaking about them. Because academia, particularly in the critical disciplines, surprisingly, has this sort of secular bias that makes it hard to talk about religious, spiritual, and especially mystical or metaphysical things. But the things I was learning were too powerful not to bring into conversation with the things I was talking about academically. So in that text, I just jumped off the ledge and said, I can't proceed further in my life without bringing these threads together. And I did it. And I'm thankful that what I've discovered since authoring that book is that there's a community of people out in the world that feels the same way I do, that spiritual and religious and mystical and metaphysical things inform how we move and make change in the world, and that having vigorous conversations about how those things can be brought to bear on each other yields really important fruit. So I will always be in that line of inquiry and interest.
I have noticed it at our professional guilds. Mine is the Society for Biblical Literature, but I also hang out at the AAR, American Academy of Religion. I've noticed that it's the womanists who are pressing to integrate spirituality and practice with the academy. And I find that such an incredible gift to all of us. There was a question over here. Sir, you had a question?
Well, I do, but I'm not sure it's, we'll get a simple answer, but part of my perplexity is I'm well versed with the Baha'i approach of the grassroots level to these problems of race and the dichotomy or the paradigm that we have in our country of partisanship, right or wrong, your version against my version. People are entrenched in that idea, and that's what the civil rights movement more or less grew out of and used as a tool. And I think a good example recently was we attended the Facing Race Awards for the St. Paul Foundation, in which Rashad Robinson, who is the CEO of Facing Race, presented some of his background and kind of using that paradigm of not disunity, but divisiveness. They were able to mobilize their base to basically create a massive defunding of the radical, I would say prejudicial political group called Alika. And I think that was a massively positive thing that happened. So here's my question. That kind of happened right now in your face, kind of today's news cycle. Whereas the approach that the Baha'is have is, as our speaker has said, is a long-term, getting to know individuals on a human, individual friendship basis, building those relationships, spreading those concepts at the grassroots level. How do we rationalize those two approaches to maximize change?
Did you catch that?
I think I did. And my answer to that would be that Baha'is in the many walks of life where they work and live, so for example, in their professions and so on, have varying degrees of power and access in the public spheres where the policies and big decisions of society are decided and carried out, and their obligation is to figure out how to enact those principles, like the nonpartisanship that you mentioned, but other kinds of principles to move things in the direction towards human well-being. So it's in fact a feature of the fact of where Baha'is might be located, Baha'is with particular forms of influence, and the ways in which they're able to work. For example, just to give one example, we have within the United Nations a very well-established NGO, the Baha'i International Community, that has the ability to interface with things that go on in the United Nations and influence things in the direction of Baha'i principles where appropriate. And so that would be an example of a formation. The Baha'is that work there have a particular form of influence. However, that influence is linked to an ongoing consultative relationship with the larger Baha'i community and the Baha'i elected guiding bodies and so on. And so the idea is that we do also seek to influence things at a more structural and systemic level, but it comes largely to those places where we have access through our own professions and forms of livelihood and relationships and so on. The same thing also can be said in the business community. Some Baha'is have very elevated and powerful positions in the business community nationally or globally and are able to achieve things in that sphere or to influence things in that sphere based on that position. There are also specific actions that our elected bodies take, such as the National Spiritual Assemblies of the United States and other countries, in terms of either addressing things in the media or addressing things in the government And generally speaking, we don't do that on a one-off kind of basis based on individuals, but our national bodies have relationships with those kinds of entities to exercise influence.
Thank you.
Dr. Yetunde,
Unless someone else has a burning question.
I didn't see.
So my question has to do with the Black Lives Matters movement and intentional spiritual formation. And I'm wondering, Dr. Maparyan, what if you have a critique regarding Black Lives Matters movement from a Baha'i perspective, what would that critique be? That's one question. Second question is there an intentional spiritual formation process within the Baha'i community as it relates to racial transformation?
Yes, I'll start with the second question. Yes, there's definitely an intentional spiritual formation process. And I would say there are multiple sub-processes that are part of a larger process. I mean, the idea of working on racism is a permanent part of Baha'i activity worldwide. I mean, it's embedded in everything that we do and think about. And there are particular communities. For example, there's a group that emerged on Facebook within the last year or so that specifically is working on racism issues in terms of understanding them in ways that connect with discourses like Black Lives Matter and other similar things, and developing a Baha'i understanding or strategy in alignment with that. So those things, yes, they're permanently part of Baha'i community life at individual and collective levels. The first question that you asked was if I had a critique of the Black Lives Matter movement from a Baha'i perspective. And actually, I would not offer a critique on the broad level, because I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is actually based on one of the Baha'i principles that I talked about in my talk today, which is the nobility of all humans, the inherent nobility of all humans. To me, Black Lives Matter means Black people are noble human beings. Like, that's what I hear when I hear Black Lives Matter. I think that they also agree that everybody has noble underpinnings, but it's saying that the discourse has not acknowledged the nobility of Black people, of Black lives, and that they're coming to restore that. So I hear that as the animating impulse of the Black Lives Matter movement, which in my mind is very aligned with the Baha'i viewpoint as well. Now, if I were to offer any critiques, they might be on a more granular level. For example, if there were ever any particular action taking place where people maybe started peacefully, but then launched into some, more conflictual activities around the fringes, I might critique that, because I think that it's important to avoid those kind of actions whenever possible. And I can't say that I would maybe 100% agree with every single plank of the sort of official platform that they put out, but they are definitely oriented towards social justice. Another thing that I will say as a womanist scholar and as a person who is Afrocentrically inclined, that there is so much spiritual wisdom in the deep cosmology of African-centered perspectives that has yet to really deeply penetrate the Western social change discourse. There's a lot of understandings about life and about divinity, about the immanent nature of divinity within creation, about the interconnectedness of people, that I think also animates many things that emerge out of the Black community but doesn't always get articulated, that I think also animates Black Lives Matter. And so I very much stand with Black Lives Matter, and maybe if they're pulling out civil disobedience and that, I would just, as a Baha'i, respectfully not participate in that part. But nevertheless, the generating impulse that it's restoring an equality of nobility to all people is where it's at, as far as I'm concerned.
One more question. May I ask one more question? I think we're all inspired. I think you've contributed to our frameworks by, as we engage in dialogue between this interfaith, but primarily Christian seminary, and you as a Baha'i woman of spirit and faith. You talked about it being a slow process, and you talked about planting seeds. Do you have any words for how you would encourage predominantly white, predominantly Christian seminarians and their teachers to plant seeds, what seeds would you most like to see planted right now?
You know, without knowing what seeds have already been planted, I would say that there are a few important seeds that I always recommend to everybody. One is planting the seed of self-reflection so that we are always, as Baha'u'llah says, bring ourselves to account each day, and reviewing how we've moved in the world and what kinds of internal thoughts and feelings we've had, and making sure that we are constantly in a process of working to align our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions with our values and our ideals. That's a process that anyone of any background can and should have. Similarly, I recommend to many audiences who are caught up in the fray of challenging racial dialogues to cultivate the tools of non-defensiveness, which is the ability to not take things that are challenging or directed at one based on injustice personally, but to stand back and look at them from a place of loving non-attachment and understand that we're all together trying to work towards ideals. Because I've seen many, many conversations get derailed by people taking things too personally and jumping into a defensive mode right away. And most of what I've learned about non-defensiveness comes from Buddhism, I'll be honest. Buddhism has a very well-developed set of understandings and strategies to cultivate non-defensiveness, and I recommend it to everyone. I think externally, a really important seed to plant is a seed of helping society being embracing of spiritual contributions to social change, discourse, and action. And also to make sure that we're always every day moving from ideals and principles to action. One thing that womanism and Baha'i both have in common is that they're very practical. They don't just want to stay in the realm of words. They want to get out into the world and affect people's lived experience. And so, you know, all of us in the academy are at the risk of staying in the realm of theory and thought, but we have to move into the place of the heart as well as into the place of action out in the world. And that is another seed that I was plant and put a lot of water on.
That's a lot of water.
Dr. Maparyan and I don't know each other. And the fact that you put this presentation together so thoughtfully and artfully and spent so much time with us, I know that only came out of your heart. Not out of any connection with me or with the school. So thank you very much for already a fan, and now you're doing your fan club. That's wonderful, and also wonderful that we have some engagement with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Professors at United. Wow, okay, so Carolyn, the question before was posed before you came. What does it mean for United to be a seminary that is also seminary for Baha'i? And we are doing this right now. This is what it means. We don't know really what it means. Right now, in this moment, this is what it means. To be teaching ITC in the house, and Presbyterian, right?
United Church of Christ.
Sorry, this is together, African American, Caucasian, European American, together, teaching together. What's the name of your course?
Interpretation is resistance.
Did you hear that?
Interpretation as resistance.
All right, so we're about the work of change and transformation here. Thank you all for being here. What is next on our agenda is a break for you all, and then come back at 4 o'clock if you like for our film, and then at 6 o'clock our panel. Do you all have our schedule? That has something to do with why you have some questions. Okay, sorry about that. At 4 o'clock, either here, just we decided, in set, we're going to show the new film, Who is Baha'i? And we'll have a discussion. At 6 o'clock, we'll have a panel, The Evolution of Baha'i Chaplaincy Studies at United, with Emily, Dr. Tom, Dr. Stockman, and Jesse, here, our interreligious admissions counselor, Then at 7 o'clock, we're gonna have a Life of Unity feast beginning in the Context Cafe with dinner on us and ending here in the Bigelow Chapel. Tomorrow, Dr. Stockman, who's sitting here, who is the Executive Director of the Wilmette Institute, will be addressing our Introduction to Spiritual and Personal Transformation class. You can come, bring people. We started at 8:15 in the Stepper room, but Dr. Stockman will join us